Today's video is going to be a little bit different than normal. I'm going to have a big chunk of real time showing you how to paint rain and just the messy background that I did here. And then at the end, I did find a 20-minute long version of my elephants walking through rain. It's faster than I would like to have for you guys, but it's all I've got because it is an older video, but I think it'll give us a good idea of how this works in practice. So we'll do the simple version and then see how it looks when you actually apply it to wildlife art. So I'm just making a messy background here. I am mixing some water in with my paint. Next time I do one of these real-time videos, I think I'm going to try to remember to set up my camera so that you can see my palette and see how I'm mixing the water in with the paint. So that is a future goal for the very near future. I'm just leaving my brush strokes showing on this. I just want to create texture. And this portion of the painting, it's not something where I'm trying to make it super realistic or very good. Not something I'm going to sell, but I just needed a background. And this is a Fredrix watercolor canvas board. If you have a hard time getting smooth backgrounds on your acrylic paintings, this canvas board or a watercolor canvas may be an option that you really like. They're so smooth, so it makes blending a lot easier. When you've got the rougher canvases, that dry brushing look that I'm always talking about, how much I dislike it, where you can see the paint is kind of catching on the tooth of the canvas. You've got those bumpy looks. You don't get that a whole lot with a watercolor canvas because it is so smooth. Just setting that up on the edge of my easel so I can get the bottom of it. Next, I dried this and then I'm adding another layer with the paint. Now this time I'm intentionally dry brushing where there's not much water, there's not much paint on my brush at all, and I'm just letting it catch the canvas so that I get this sort of textured look. And this works a lot better with a sponge brush, but apparently I'm being too lazy to go out and get one. But those sponge brushes that you get in the craft section of the art supply store, if you just get them damp and then get just a tiny bit of paint on them, they work really well for getting this sort of texture in the background. The paintbrush tends to get smoother brush strokes, so it's harder to get the rough look I was trying to do here. You can see as the paint is wet, if I put wet paint into wet paint, it's just blending wet into wet, so I get too smooth of a look. And that just is going to come down to what look you're going for. So I drew out where I want my the river coming through or stream coming through with a white charcoal pencil. If you use graphite, it's not going to show up, and if it does show up, it's not going to erase all the way, so I don't recommend that. Now I'm adding my trees, and I'm just creating texture. With this one, I don't really have any reference photos, which I do recommend if you're doing a real piece of artwork, use some reference photos so that you get the general shape of the trees and the coloring and everything how you want it. But here, because I just need something in the background so I can show you how to paint fog over it, I'm using a filbert brush. This is a Taklon bristled filbert. This is one of the ones that Hobby Lobby carries. They're Master's Touch brushes. They're generic brushes, which normally I don't like art supply stores generic products, but I love their brushes because they're really cheap, and I think about once a month they go on sale for half price, so I always stock up then. So I'm just getting my general shapes in there, and then you can see as I do these the little clumps of tree, I'm not just dabbing the brush in there, I'm actually making small brush strokes, and it's almost like X's back and forth. Using some black in there so I can get some different textures, or different values, I'm sorry. I've mixed black with the green, so I've got this nice dark color. And when I do the different layers like this, I am not trying to cover up the previous layer completely. I need those colors to show. I want all of the light greens, dark greens, blacks. I need all of it to show through. So when you layer like this, don't feel like you're just going to slop one layer on top of the other and cover the previous layer completely. That is definitely not the goal here. So for the grass here, notice that my brush, instead of just being X's, I'm moving the brush side to side horizontally. As I move up into the trees, I go back into those sort of crisscross shapes. And then for the grass, I'm back to mostly working horizontally, which is going to help me. Well, apparently I'm going to pull the trees down further first, but this is going to help me to create the right perspective. Add some highlights in there. You can see where the grass kind of fades off into the trees in the center there. That is going to stay with horizontal brush strokes. Anywhere where I've got these crisscross type patterns, those are going to be my trees. And even though they're the same color, just adjusting how you're moving your brush, that can make a big difference in the texture and what you're actually painting. So here, back to the horizontal lines, side to side. And I'm not trying to create a solid mass of green. I want my brush strokes to show for this. If I painted it perfectly smooth, it's just not going to look right. So this is a fun way to paint grass in a very, very simple way. And I'll come back through and add a few individual strands of grass, but by letting some of this show, you can create the texture or the look of the grass in the landscape in the distance without having to do a lot of work. So I've mixed a bit of yellow and white in with my green. So I've got bits of sun shining through. Weird, given that I'm making a stormy painting here. Adding some of that brighter greenish yellow onto the trees. Now, here's the thing. If I were being serious about trying to make a really good painting, probably wouldn't have put that yellow back there, because what I'm doing in adding the yellow is I'm actually messing up my depth. Now the trees in the background feel as close to the viewer as the yellow up front. Adding the yellow brings that forward. It makes it feel like that area is closer to the viewer, the warmer colors like that. If I wanted this to really have a lot of depth, I should have used blue to push those trees back. But like I said, this was just a quick sample so that I could show you how to do the other part that the tutorial is actually about. So onto the water, I'm starting by adding black. Actually, there's a little bit of blue mixed in with this black, but mostly it's just black. Notice that the movement of the water, it's not just a straight line coming all the way down. See how I've got these horizontal lines? It zigzags back and forth, and I've got to have these sections that come out very long horizontally. Just doing a zigzag down, straight down, won't look right, like a chevron type pattern that was even. That won't give you perspective. Look how in the background I've got this long horizontal line, short diagonal, long horizontal, short diagonal, long horizontal again, short diagonal. This is going to create more the perspective of looking back at water that's flat on the land. And that's a really big deal when you are painting or drawing water or anything that has streams or water coming through the land like this. The same thing with roads. This could also be a road. You want the long horizontal, short diagonal. Don't just have a straight line coming down. It will not look right. And that all comes down to perspective. So, I mean, ideally have a reference photo and you can really see at this angle how the water moves down or a road would move down. And yeah, sometimes you'll get photos and it's coming straight down, but as an artist, I will usually avoid drawing or painting things that way because it makes the artwork look very flat. And I'm making my colors a bit brighter than I'm going to want them in the end, just because I know when I come back over them with the fog, they're going to tone down so much that if I already start with something that's very muted, I'm really not going to see the green through it. So here I decided, well, make some flowers in the grass, just some little dots. The problem that I had, that I realized once I started painting the rain is, oh, this just looks like water splatter. So I ended up glazing yellow over my little flowers that I'm painting in here. I'm using a small round brush to create some grass up close. Notice that these little grass lines, they're slightly curved. You don't want just a bunch of straight lines all over the place. It'll make it look too stiff. As I draw these little grass strands, I'm making sure that they cross over each other too. They're not just even lines because that ends up looking like bars or a fence. I'm making sure that they clump together, very much like how you draw fur. So I'm taking this flat Taklon bristled brush, this is a gold Taklon bristle, and making my horizontal lines for the water. Now this is going to be the same thing when you do ripples in the water. You've got the long horizontal, short diagonal, long horizontal, short diagonal. This takes practice to get the movement in there, but it is definitely something that you want to get comfortable with because look at how now that looks like water moving down. And you don't want to follow the diagonal lines for the water. So up against the grass where the water's coming down at a bit of an angle on that diagonal, when I do my water ripples, I don't want to follow that. I still want to keep them very, very horizontal. That is something that you've got to watch. It's easy to want to kind of follow these lines on the diagonal instead of keeping them horizontal. And when you do that, you make your water look lopsided. You can see I've got that water where it just kind of fades off into the background. There's no definite start-stop point there. And coming back down into the grass, I'm going to go ahead and add some more of those strands. You can see I'm mostly focusing on the back of each kind of clump of landmass that sticks out into the water. Variation is really important when you're painting grass. Even if something like this where you're not going for super realistic, you still want to get variation in there and you still want to think in terms of clumps, not just individual strands sticking up everywhere. You can see as I get back here, they're going to get much, much shorter. Now, doing the strands like this is actually much, much easier with a liner brush. I would do this with maybe a number 3 synthetic hog hair liner brush would probably be my normal brush of choice. I'm being lazy and just using the round, but you have to be careful with this because if I add very much pressure at all, I get a huge clump. So if you're using a brush and you're having a hard time and you keep getting clumps, you may want to try another brush. One of the things that I always do when I'm working with either a liner brush or like this with the round, getting the little detail, after I mix my paint, load my brush, I always dab the front of my easel, get some of that paint off of it so I don't have just a huge clump of paint. It's one of the reasons when you look at my easel when I post photos and it's kind of back a bit, you can see there's tons of paint there. That's one of the main reasons I get paint there is because I use that as kind of a tester just to get some of the paint off the brush. And over the years, it does build up. I just take a razor blade every so often and cut some of it back off if I get too much of a build up there. Going to pull some more highlights on the tree here, getting a little bit of this light blue, just to cool off that yellow a bit. Now when you do trees, or you paint trees and you paint them in the way that I'm doing here, the more layers and the more colors you get, usually the better. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be different colors like green and yellow and orange. Having different values is so important. I would say always have at least 3. Black or a very like dark green, a medium green, and then the light green, maybe even highlights on top of that. But the more you do, the better it usually will look. And so when you're doing this, you may have layers you're like, wow, this looks worse than my previous layer did. That's fine. Let it dry and put more layers on top. All of those layers build up in the end to make the trees look much, much better than if you just did 2 colors. Going to let that dry a bit and then put a brighter green right over some of this. And notice I'm letting a lot of those other colors show through. Don't cover everything with each layer. Another thing too, don't try to be too perfect. When you paint trees that way, you're not going for photorealism. You're creating texture that obviously looks like a tree. You want to be pretty loose with it. Be messy. It's not going to look good up close. Back away from it and look at it from a distance, because that's what that type of tree is supposed to look like. Or this style of painting where you can really see your brush strokes. I'm not letting this dry enough in between layers, and so it starts to kind of mush together and create mud, which means I'm going to have to come back over that again when it dries. I'm going to take some blue and go over my water. And blue is generally going to be translucent enough that you can still see the darks underneath it and the whites, but it gives you just this nice tone. It's really easy just to do the black and, well, I think there was a little blue in it, but mostly black for my base layer, then my white highlights, and then the blue on top. And it looks like water in just those 3 really easy layers. Just make sure the previous layers are completely dry. And you can do the same, everything I'm doing here, you can do with oil paint too. You just want to make sure that it's drying in between layers. I'm darkening this up right in through here so that I've got a softer transition between the gray or the grass and the trees. And again, that way, when I put the fog through here later, it has the dark underneath. I think this is a good stage to really look at the hint of grass, how that looks with just a little bit up front, the little grass strands versus the background where I kept it pretty smooth. Don't try to put the same amount of grassy details in all of the grass. If I pulled that grass, the little strands, all the way back to the trees, I just lost the perspective. I lost the depth. Adding some flowers on top here. And this is where I realized after I came through with the fog or the rain, that this wasn't working for me. So I had to add yellow to it so it didn't just look like splashes of rain hitting the grass. And they're just little dots, and then I take my finger and smudge over it so I don't have what actually looks like polka dots. Just soften that out. And the nice thing that way too is you end up with more variation there. You don't want, when you do little dots like that for flowers, don't make them all the same size. You want them to clump together where some are bigger, some are smaller. Some are touching and some are not. That's really important. If you just have dots, it just ends up looking like polka dots. Well, that's fluorescent. Now, this is what the funny thing is. Now, that is looking brighter to me than what the paint does in person. But look at how now the trees, before I started putting this fluorescent green up front, look how it made the trees appear way closer than the grass up front, which doesn't make sense. It'll confuse the viewer. Watch that when you do paintings like, or any type of landscape. Get the background colors. A safe way to go is use cooler colors in the background and then your warmer yellows and bright colors up close. It will help you so much in creating more depth in the piece. So I let that dry completely, and I can't stress that enough. It needs to be completely dry. Now I'm using my transparent mixing white. This is the Liquitex Heavy Body. They do not have this in the Liquitex Basics like I normally use. I'm adding a little bit of water. Now I'm taking a stiff round brush and going in circles. Normally when you see me draw fog or paint fog, I use the airbrush. This is your alternative to use the transparent mixing white and just smudge it out. You want to use that stiff round brush because I'm blending the wet paint into dry areas. If I was blending wet into wet, that's when I'll use the mop brush. And sometimes you will see me, like here, use the mop brush for the inner sections to soften them out. But those outer edges, to get that to look soft, you need to use a stiff round brush to smudge them out. Be careful, don't keep reworking over an area that's wet. You've got to let it dry completely or it'll lift that previous layer. So smudging those edges out. Taking the mop brush to soften out the inner sections. Now I do need more white up towards the trees, but I've got to let it dry completely. If I were to put it over that now, it's just going to lift off my previous layers and make an absolute mess. And I'm putting this fog over everything, and I want it to be more concentrated back towards the trees. It's getting softer as you move up close. And you'll see how I do this with the airbrush on the portion with the elephants. It's a very similar look. It takes a little getting used to. I recommend starting small. This is a lot easier to handle on an 8x10 canvas than it is on a 30x40 inch canvas. Or I believe the one I did with the elephants is 24x30. 36. Yes, 24x36. That was a little harsh, so I added a teeny bit of water to my brush to and drop the canvas. That is one of the negatives of using these canvas boards. They are so lightweight. I end up having them fly across the room way too often. Okay, so I let that dry completely, and look at how it looks nice and foggy in the background. Now you can do the rain droplets a couple of different ways. One is to use a very, very flat, this is a Taklon bristled brush, but it is super, super flat. The bristles are really nice and tight. If this brush was remotely damaged, I would not use that brush. But because it's a brand new one, I don't think I'd used it on anything else. So it's giving me these nice, nice lines. Your other option is to use a liner brush. The liner brush, it's harder to get them straight, but it's easier to get them thin. With this flat brush, I can get these nice straight lines very easily. And you can decide how you want these. Do you want the rain to be coming at a bit of an angle, like the wind is blowing? You can have them come straight down if you prefer. I usually go at a slight angle. You want variation here too, where some are a lot lighter and kind of in the distance. They're thinner, little lines. They're not as bright. And then as I get closer or to the viewer, I want the rain droplets to be a bit bigger, a little bit thicker, and more opaque. And so some of these raindrops, for the areas that I want them to be translucent, I'm going to use more of my transparent mixing white. But where I want them to start becoming more and more opaque, that's where I'm going to switch over to my titanium white. Like that line there, you can see how dark these are. I'm just dabbing them with my thumb to tone them down so they're not too harsh. And it really depends on the type of rain that you're creating, how much of it you want, how opaque you want these lines. It's better to do a little and back away and decide if you want more than to do too much and not really easily be able to take them away. And I do have to mix a little bit of water in with my paint in order for this to flow smoothly. If I use straight paint right out of the tube, it's going to be too thick and chunky. You need to thin that down a bit. And while I do want to keep these lines as straight as I can, if it's a little off, I'm not freaking out. I would recommend, though, avoid, some people when they make these lines, they kind of curve them, almost like we did with the grass. Don't do that with these. You don't want a whole bunch of curved rain droplets. It will not look right. Now here you can see, look how bright yellow those trees are in the background. That is terrible. I would definitely, if I were to do this and want to create like a finished painting that I was going to sell, those would be much, much cooler, much more dull. I'm not sure why I left those that way. I guess because it didn't really matter, being that this is just a quick tutorial for rain, not on trees themselves. But watch that in your artwork. Okay, now I'm taking my liner brush. This is a number 2, I believe, and I'm making little teeny tiny splatters in the water. Just a few little lines. Some of these splatters are coming up where the line from the rain is actually touching and meeting the water. Some of them are just in random places, like the raindrop already hit and is just the finished splash. You want to get variation here too. Now, I am not going to put these splashes on the grass. I'm only putting it in the rain where the water would be more smooth. If I were to paint this, like you'll see later with the elephants, when I paint it on the ground or on the elephants' backs, I will have splashes there because I've got a harder surface. But on something soft like grass, I'm not going to put these little splashes coming up unless there are puddles in the grass. As I move towards the back, I just get the little teeny tiny dots. That helps me to keep the perspective where you're seeing the bigger rain droplets up close. And they get smaller and fade out towards the background. Working off camera because my videos would not be complete without having that happen at least a couple of times. It's kind of like a little V with little brush strokes coming out of that V for the pattern that I'm doing here. And I will do another video sometime in the near future with rain again. Actually, I want to do another one with elephants, but with elephants walking towards the viewer. I will be doing that sometime in the near future, and so you'll get to see rain in action again on a real piece. And that will have the slower sections than what you're going to see on the elephants coming up. Now, if you look at those flowers that I did in the white, see how it almost now looks like water, or it's just more of the rain splashing on the grass. That's where I was like, nope, I've got to fix that, and I'll come through with a yellow. I'm also adding more fog in the background here, since that area is dry, and that again is the transparent mixing white. You can layer on top of layer when you want, depending on how thick you want that area to be. Just let it dry in between layers or you'll lift off the previous. And it looks like I took a break. Nope, I'm back. Brightening up some of the little white splatters up close. Just a little. Here's where I'm going to go ahead and put a bit of yellow. I'm going to change these flowers to yellow from white so that they don't look like they're just part of the rain splatter. Yellow is very translucent, so I can go over the green and the white. I don't have to be careful about where that's put. So that is it for this one. So you got to see real time how I'm making the rain. So next, let's go ahead and take a look at how you can do this in practice where you've got wildlife as your subject or anything really as your subject. So this painting is sped up by 10. I apologize. It's original old footage on my old video camera, but I'm starting by making a base layer of gray. That gray has a teeny bit of phthalo blue mixed into it. Just going to create a bit of texture back here. This is all being done in acrylic. This is on a Fredrix linen canvas. Took me a minute to remember which one it was. So it's really, really smooth. I love these linen canvases so much. So doing wet into wet clouds, which you guys have seen me done before, sprayed them with water, blended it out with the mop brush. Now down here I'm creating sand, and to create this sand, the rocky texture, I'm taking a stiff brush and a palette knife and I'm flicking various shades of grays, whites, and blacks, and it just creates that texture. Most of this is going to be softened out with the airbrush, which is like what I did for the fog with the transparent mixing white. So it doesn't have to be perfect, I just need a little texture there. Drew out the elephants with my white charcoal pencil, And what I'm doing here is drawing in the puddles on the ground. Some of them around the elephant's feet. Now this actual piece, when I first started the video, actually no, it hasn't come up yet, it's coming up in just a second, you're going to see my reference photo. This one is from Paint My Photo. I'm not going to leave this on long, and it's really small because I don't actually have permission to be sharing reference photos with you guys from that site, but I do want you to see the colors that these elephants were. Look at the color that it came in, and look at how you adjusting my colors and then making the fog, it changed the atmosphere and feel of this photo so much. There it is in the corner. So it was a dry day. It looks like a warm day. Everything's in browns. They're on dirt. And the colors that I'm changing, I just completely changed the feel of it between the colors and the way that I'm going to soften everything out. Now, as I paint elephants, I'm not trying to draw in every individual line carefully. I'm letting my brush strokes show, and I'm pulling a lot of that blue from the background into the trunk as well, or into the skin in general. I'm working on the trunk now, so it's blue, but that will be all over the place. I'm using grays and creams, browns. And this is going to look too harsh against this background, but I know all of this is going to get toned down with the airbrush later. And with the airbrush, I'm mostly just going to use white. Very, very simple to create that foggy atmosphere. Getting some shadows, and this, much like the trees, I know I need to let the areas that I'm painting now be a little bit harsher than what I'm going to need, knowing that I'm going to be airbrushing white over everything. It's going to tone it down a lot. So if I go very muted right now, when I come back with the white, you're not going to see anything. It's going to cover too much. So I'm going to let it be a little bit more, I'm having a hard time talking, a little bit more harsh than what I want my end result to be. And knowing how harsh to make it and that sort of thing comes with practice. The more you paint and experience it and do it to where you went too light one time, too dark another time, that's how you're going to learn how light or dark to be. Don't be afraid of making a mistake. Those mistakes are important. That's how you're going to learn. So just experiment and see what happens. Look how far back my hand is on this brush. You're going to have a lot more control if you learn to keep your hand very far back on your paintbrushes versus right up close. It lets you have better movement with the brush. Now the lines that I'm putting in here, I'm pretty much just making them crisscross back and forth. I'm watching my reference photo. I'm making sure they go in the general direction. They curve where they need to be. They're straight where they need to be. Watch for that sort of thing, but I'm not worried about shading each individual wrinkle in perfectly. I'm not going for hyperrealism. A lot of these brush strokes, they're very sketchy, and all of these brush strokes showing are good in the end. That helps me to create more texture in the elephant's skin. I'm really just focusing at this point on where my lights and my darks go, just blocking it in. Making sure when you're painting elephants that those wrinkles are going in the right direction is just as important as when you're drawing animals that have a lot of fluffy fur or feathers, and you've got to make sure those go in the right direction. If you just do straight lines all over or they're going the wrong way, you can make the elephant look very deformed or flat. Look at the contrast that I've got on the ear there. Well, that will be softened out later. Look how three-dimensional that looks, and it's not even well blended. It's just making sure I get my darks super dark and the light so light over it. Getting those in the right place is what's going to help you to create dimension in your artwork. Don't be afraid of that high contrast. As long as you've got your shadows and your lights in the right place, that high contrast is probably going to look pretty good. Now these colors of this elephant, even though I am pulling in some of that grayish blue from the background, this would still be a lot more brown than I would recommend. You're gonna wanna pull more of the blues there. Yeah, great, it stands out, but it stands out too much. It looks like it was cut out from something else and stuck on here. You wanna make sure that your subject is blending in with your background, that it works with your background. I shouldn't say blending in, I don't want it to get lost, but I do want it to feel like it's a part of that background. Here I start crisscrossing back and forth, and now I'm using the light. I have the dark lines first. Now I'm coming back through with the lighter colors. And a lot of these lighter colors, they're the same as the background color, just a little bit lighter than that grayish blue color. And anytime you're trying to mix a grayish color, where it's grayish blue, grayish green, whatever, the easiest way to do that is first mix the gray, mix your black and your white, then pull in the other color. So there, I would mix in a little bit of that phthalo blue. Started with black and white, then pulled in some of the blue. Now, for the legs, they feel like they're just kind of floating. They look very, very odd, and that is one thing that was so great to be able to come through with the airbrush and tone it down, soften it up, because that pushed that leg back instead of random line coming in between the baby elephants. You'll see that soon. But just in case, I'm still putting all of the lines and texture in there for anything that might show through. Add some more detail here with the lines on the nose. You see, I'm layering a lot of these wrinkles and creating even more texture, crossing back and forth. I'm not just going over the lines that are already there, I'm adding to them. And the funny thing is, you'd look at it and think, oh, elephants, it's going to take so long with all those wrinkles. You don't need to make them exact. You just need them close, going in the right direction. I'm glazing the black or ivory black for a lot of the darks in here, so you can still see through it. It's fairly translucent versus the Mars black that is going to be more opaque. For the lines that I needed really dark, I left that with the Mars black. And then when I wanted to just glaze and tint some of the areas of the elephant so it's a little bit darker over large sections, that's where I switched over to the ivory black. More crisscrossy little lines. I'm going to do the same thing on the baby elephants. While this piece is really large, it did not take me more than a couple of, I'd say 3 or 4 days to finish. It was a few years ago, so I don't totally remember, but I know that it was faster than you would expect for something that looks like it has so much detail. One of the joys of acrylic, painting fast, and if I were to do this with oil, I would do it the same way, except not with the airbrush. Then I would just use zinc white, which is a translucent white, and I would do the fog like I did in the forest before or earlier, where I just glazed that over areas that I needed to be really foggy. But because I'm not sitting here worrying about every single line being exact to the photo, just going in the right direction instead, it moves very, very quickly. And I really do like the results I got. I don't feel like it looks like it was rushed. And I'm just glazing the brown over the black that I previously did here. That glaze has a lot of water. Remember, when you're adding more water, the more water that you add, the more translucent that color is going to be. It also lessens the adhesiveness of the paint. So when you're layering on top of that, if you use too much water and you layer on top and really jam the brush into the paint, it can lift up that previous layer. So that's just something to be aware of. Normally, the way that I work, how I thin it out, I'm not adding so much that would even remotely be a problem. And I have a lot of people ask me, because there is a video out there on YouTube where a woman's telling people all of the horrible things that will happen if you use a bunch of water with your acrylics. It's completely untrue in practice. Some of what she's saying is true, but a lot of it is kind of scare tactic. She actually had to turn the comments off on that video, and I'm assuming because too many people were telling her she was wrong. But don't let that scare you. I have a video talking about what I do to make sure that doesn't happen, and I'll put a link in the video description here. It's funny, this video I'm showing you guys because I want to show you how to use rain in practice, but look at how much setup time it takes. The actual rain and fog, super, super fast. Most of it is just getting your setup, everything blocked in first. And here's another example. Look at the way that the water is right now up against the sanded portions, the lines that I have for the water. They just look like they're floating out of nowhere. The elephant's feet just look like they're kind of floating. This does not look good right now because I don't have the atmosphere in there yet. Same thing on this little guy over here. Now the brush that I'm using right now, it's not terribly small. I believe that's a Filbert. I could be wrong on that. It might be a round. But the point is, I'm getting thin lines like you would with a liner brush, but that's because of how I'm holding the brush to the side and barely letting the bristles touch the canvas. It makes it a lot faster because I can use that single brush to get thick lines or thin lines just based on how I was holding it. Just remember, the harder you push with a brush, the thicker that line is going to be. Getting some highlights in here. Okay, so you can see the harshness that I have right now. I've not come through with the airbrush. I'm adding a few little sprinkles for water, and this could be done after the airbrush. I'm not sure why I decided to do this first, but those little splatters like you saw me do. Now I'm coming through with the airbrush, and I am softening out especially around the feet. So I get that nice mist. I'm gonna go over portions of the body that I want to push back. I'm mostly gonna leave their heads forward, so I'm not gonna put a whole lot of airbrushing over that. A little bit over the mom's trunk because she is back farther, so the babies are going to have less airbrush over them than the mom does. Really focusing around the feet. See how it just pushes that back? The same thing with the water. The water now has mist over everything, so before where it looked really weird between the sand and the water, it just fades into it. Putting a few sections over the elephant's bodies, getting a lot in the background here. Can't really see what I'm doing there, but same thing, just softening everything out, softening the edges of the elephant. Now I'm doing the water droplets. So you can see that actually went really fast. I had that done in probably 10 minutes. I'm coming now through like I did on the other video and just doing my rain droplets coming through. This is with a stiff flat brush, or I'm sorry, just a flat brush. I don't know why I said stiff first. I'm adding the little splatters on the baby's back. That's something to notice that I did. It was unfortunately faster than I would like, but I've got little splatters coming up on the elephant's back too. So it's not just that you're going to put splatters from the rain if it's hitting water. It can come if it's hitting the road where it splashes back up. The elephant's back, if you're painting a horse, you may have some of those splatters coming up off the back of the horse. Just anything solid that the rain might bounce off of, you're going to put a few splatters here and there that just helps in the illusion of rain. And that is it. Again, I'm planning to do another one very similar, but with the elephant walking towards you in the rain in the very near future. So you'll see the slower version of painting that elephant then. But I wanted to show you here how I was able to use a subject that was not in rain at all and just adding the atmosphere with the airbrush, or you can use the titanium mixing white, or the transparent mixing white, forgot the word again. You can use that to create a lot of the atmosphere that I did with the airbrush here.